And we're live. So, welcome to Fully Human Connections. I'm your host, King, and I'm joined with my co-host, Reggie. So, how are you doing today, Reggie?
I'm doing real well, King. It's always great to look forward to this time with you on Wednesday mornings. So, yeah, I'm ready to go.
And so am I. Today we don't have our other co-host, Kent, join us, but he'll be back soon. And, we'll continue our discussion around your book. But before we do, let's get started with saying what we're grateful for, our gratitude moment. So you want to begin with that, what you're grateful for?
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to risk sounding like a broken record, but I'll always lead with this. I have a refrigerator with food in it, and I have indoor plumbing. But beyond that, I woke up this morning. I'm healthy. I can breathe. I can move my body. And beyond that, everything else is a luxury for me. So I'm grateful for all those basics. And I'm just grateful that you and I have the opportunity to use this technology to speak to each other about things that we feel are important and invite others in to this fully human connection. So thank you for that. And yourself.
Absolutely. Well, like you, I definitely sound like a broken record. I'm grateful for it. Each morning I wake up, I'm grateful for my life, my health, the ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, run, and have sound mind. I'm grateful for the 24 hours to my purpose in life. Grateful for my mother still to be in my life and still be of sound mind, of kind heart, and a grateful spirit. And then I'm also grateful, I actually recently purchased a dog. And I've been looking for a dog for some time. And I'm really grateful because her spirit and her temperament is like right in line with mine. It really, really sweet dog. And so I had dogs previously when I was younger, but I had never studied how to be a pet owner.
Okay.
I just assumed that, okay, I want a dog, I get a dog. And I never responsibility, I should say, not trouble, responsibility. And so this time I watched so many videos, and I'm just so much ready. And I'm so prepared. So now I don't take her not listening to as personal as I used to in the past. I now understand that it's on me, like if she made a mistake in the house, that was something I would be, the way I was raised with other folks, you throw the dog's nose in it, you try to, as opposed to not understanding that the bad behaviors the dog has is because the dog has been taught well by me. So it's my error. I have to fix. So I have to be more patient, more tolerant. And I'm definitely, in that space now, which to me is really an excellent segue into what I think, my thought process of which your topics of your book is really understanding kind of how to be fully human. So for folks who may be new to our podcast and didn't hear the first session we did, why don't you, if you wouldn't mind, saying the title of your book and kind of the premise of your book into the context of our discussion.
Great. Thank you for that, King. And before, as I lead into that, I just want to go back to what you said about training the dog, because that's really part of the theme of the book. I mean, not the dog part per se, but basically, in what I heard you say was, rather than the old school way of thinking the dog is wrong, so you do aggressive or mean things to the dog when he or she makes a mess or doesn't make it outside in order to relieve himself or herself. That I have to just change how I'm dealing with the dog because it's not the dog is just being a dog. And an underlying theme in the book, Healing America's Narratives, is that each of us, straight, bi, trans, all humans. I don't think the word all has to be qualified. We say all, everybody, including. Well, if you say everybody, you don't have to qualify what it means. It's checking our own view and our own story first. not that we're always going to be wrong, not that you did something wrong to the dog, just to stay with that for another moment or two, just to change in history specifically. It's probably true in other nations as well, but the book focuses on this country, is marked by people, mostly European males, coming to what we now call the Americas, bumping into, on the way over, taking Africans and kidnapping them, thinking that because they were different, they were inferior, and treating them to again, the Caribbean, South America, North America, and bumping into the indigenous peoples here, unfamiliar traditions and appearances, thinking beyond difference. Oh. So what the book is really about is collectively, everyone in this country, and I like to say left and right because the left and the right are all culpable in this history for different reasons, different specific events and incidents, but it's not, and they're always pointing their fingers at each other. It comes down to, again, each of us checking our view against what's provably true. I believe this. Oh, is there any evidence for it? Let me say. And so the stories that I investigate in the book, first, beginning with the underlying premise that the country has a collective shadow, which is really the sum of individual shadows. And where shadow, just to get clear on the language, is the Jungian sense of that part of me that I'm not aware of. So I don't know it's there. And if you say it's there, I deny it because I don't know it. Right. So we have to learn to recognize what we deny and don't know about. Own it. Okay, that's really part of me. And then integrate it. Don't make believe it's not there. But, becoming increasingly fully human by integrating the things I didn't know were there. So that's the premise. Among the American shadow, among the elements in it are ignorance, arrogance, fear, bigotry, violence, greed, untrustworthiness, and a couple of others. In the specific way I explore it in the book, and I'm going to take a breath here in a moment, but the specific way I explored in the book is through 5, call them episodes or events in American history. And I do some, I give less attention to a few other issues that I raise, but the 5 big ones that each get a chapter in the book are the fear of the feminine and the subjugation of women. Again, that's not unique to America. It's virtually every culture, East and West, has done that. The kidnapping of Africans, slavery, African Americans, right up through Jim Crow, lynchings, and into the civil rights of the 60s, and still fighting for to take what's in various amendments, the 13th and 14th for sure, and beyond the language in the amendments to the Constitution, making it real in everyday life, which we haven't really accomplished yet. Native Americans, who were basically lied to, slaughtered, removed from their lands, many of whom are still on reservations today, the worst parts of this country geographically in terms of being able to grow anything. So that history. And then 2 more current histories, what led up to the war in Vietnam and its aftermath, and repeating almost exactly the same mistakes, what led up to the war on terror, the post 9/11 war on terror, specifically in Afghanistan and Iraq. So if we just take those 5 and we explore ignorance, arrogance, fear, bigotry, violence, greed, etc., anyone who says that this is the greatest country in the world and everybody should aspire to be like us, without owning that history, is extraordinarily partial and in some kind of denial. I'm happy to be in this country. I'm glad I was born here. I'm 2nd generation Italian American. My grandparents were immigrants. And there are far worse places to be born on this planet. So it's not an anti-American book. In fact, I think it's a very pro-American book, one of the early reviews called an aching love story for an America, with the potential to change. So that's an underlying kind of brief summary of the book. I don't want to speak incessantly here. So and I'll continue if you want, but anything coming up for you, as I just provide that overview, which I know you've heard already.
Well, no, yeah, several things, and one of them, I would say my initial reaction, as you and I get to know each other, but if I did not know you, and I was pick this book up on the shelf, saw the title, read the premise, and then, to be honest, saw your picture, right? I would say myself. So what would give? I would be curious to say this white gentleman wrote this book about these narratives in America, where folks will look at that most of these narratives were created by the white. Right. So that's white man writing about it. So I'm just curious to say, from that perspective, what inspired you to write it, and why did you choose those 5 topics? So it's kind of a twofold question. There's a lot of answers to both those questions, but those would be my 2 initial.
Yeah. So first of all, I'll tell you, I love that question, and no one has asked that before. And the reason I love it is because as I was writing the book, I anticipated that question. All right, so and I'm just going to put an asterisk next to one of the things that Ta-Nehisi Coates writes in Between the World and Me is he constantly refers to people who think they're white. Now, I'm not going to get into why he says that, but it makes perfect sense. So when my grandparents came over at the end of the 16th century, not really, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, right at the turn there, they were not treated as whites. They were dark-skinned Italians. They didn't have a language, and no comparison to what it was like to be a Native American or a slave. So I'm not making a comparison there, but they weren't included as white people. They weren't treated that way. So I lean towards, I say Italian American, second generation, rather than white. But effectively, yes, I'm a white guy. I'm a cisgendered heterosexual white guy born in the mid-50s. So to the question, it really, so one reason I wrote it is because I chose to be an educator out of college. I began as a high school teacher and a high school basketball coach, as a college administrator. So I went into education and I was doing that in Yonkers, New York, and in New Rochelle, New York, where, right on both of those border the Bronx, both of those cities border the Bronx. So my student body, both at the college and at the high school, was a mix of New York City based ethnicities, which is just it's like the UN, predominant white, because I began to teach in the 70s, and then I was a poet in a school for about 15 years. I was in schools in New York City, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut, New Haven, and then some of the suburbs like Farmington and Avon, and then places across the country. So I work with inner city kids, suburban kids, and rural kids, all of those. But what led me, a variety of things led me to this particular book in no particular order. I'm about 5'6", 135 pounds. I've never been any taller than that. A couple of times I was maybe a little bit heavier, but and I was not bullied horribly or to any great extent when I was younger, but it happened a few times. And early on in my life, I did not know how to fight back, either verbally, to speak up for myself, or physically, because most people were a lot bigger and stronger than I was. And so I grew up with a real resentment of and a real opposite view of anybody who bullied anybody. I didn't like seeing that happen anywhere. And when I learned that my brain and my mouth worked pretty well together, I learned at about the age of 17 or 18 that I could intimidate people. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but I learned I could use my mouth to back people up. I learned I had good energy. So I would step in, and I didn't care who it was. I'm glad I'm still alive. I would step in when I saw people being bullied. Okay, fast forward to your question now. As I read history and learned more, and as I've written some books prior to this, I've written a book of poems on gun violence in America. What I began to see was what greater examples of bullying, and we don't use that language in terms of history so much, but if you look at what happened when, beginning with, Columbus, in the Caribbean and in South America, and in the, the French and the English in what we now call North America, the behaviors that they exhibited when they met the indigenous peoples here were bullying for the every single European was a bully, but collectively, Europeans bullied the indigenous peoples in this country. When the Europeans found the continent of Africa and they met Africans for the first time, different language, different parents, different cultures, rather than just, oh, different, it was, oh, we're superior. They don't have guns the way we have guns. They don't have the same God that we have, but we know we have the one true God. So all of that. And so, in terms of bullying, oh, let's kidnap them and make them into slaves. I mean, that's, bullying at its potentially at its worst, I would assume. So when I began to get the idea of writing a book that would begin to invite people to consider their own narratives and work on healing them in this country, I wanted to, and there were, every ethnicity who wasn't English speaking who came over here could tell a story of being bullied. There are no exceptions. That you're Polish, German, you're Irish, you're Italian, didn't matter. But for the foundational subjugations that built this country, I would say it's a moral imperative, if you're paying attention, to include the Native American and the African American stories, because between slavery and the removal of Native Americans and slaughter of Native Americans, those are two foundational elements from the, you could say 1600s forward, but even earlier than that forward. Even within those cultures, not in every single example, but the subjugation of women was, again, women were considered inferior. And I know there are some Aboriginal indigenous cultures which historically there were some matriarchal societies, but what happened in the continental, what we call the United States now, wasn't one of them. So speaking about women, Native Americans, African Americans were givens for me. They had to be included if it's a historical exploration. Once I looked at what I identified as these 9 traits of shadow, ignorance, arrogance, fear, bullying, violence, greed, what led up to Vietnam, post-World War II America, and the history of what led up to our involvement there was a 20th century, mid-20th century manifestation of all of those traits. And then I decided to include the post-9/11 war on terror because we didn't learn anything, even though Robert McNamara wrote a book, in retrospect, and owned the mistakes of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, in which he was a Secretary of Defense and an architect of the war. A rare moment in American history where one of the leaders stepped forward and said, "We screwed this up. We made a mistake." Who's done that since? I don't think anybody. So the Bush, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld rush to war after 9/11, especially the rush into Iraq, it took them 2 years, but they got there, was just another example of this American exceptionalism and kind of arrogance, where we thought we just go in and do what we wanted to do because we had been attacked. So that's the historical reasons I picked those 5. One last thing I'll say, and you mentioned it, so what's up with this white guy while you're writing the book? And one of the reasons really is because I thought about that. There were reasons that, Carol Gilligan and, other women wrote books about women. And need for equal rights. And I had I can name 15. I just got a mental blank there. I'll come back to them. There are reasons that James Baldwin and more recently, Ibram Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates were writing about the Black experience because it was their experience. So when we talk about white privilege, a phrase that can be accurate and is often bandied about, I think, unskillfully by some people who actually alienate whites who would otherwise be their allies. But one of the reasons I could write this book is because I didn't have to just take the African American view and write about that. I didn't just have to take a woman's view. I'm not a woman. I'm not a Native American. I was eligible for Vietnam, and by the grace of God, my lottery number came up really high when I was eligible. So because of certain privilege, I had the ability to take a wider view of this country's history from a standpoint of shadow and integrate a selected few of the examples of that shadow and speak as accurately as I could to each of them. Again, women, Native Americans, African Americans, the Vietnam mistakes, and the post 9/11 mistakes. So I love the question, because if I were a Native American, and I'm making this up now, I'm going to project this, and this may not be true. If I were Native American, if I were a woman, or if I were Black, I might have a different focus because of my experience growing up. Because the bullying experience, everybody gets that. Some in really horrible ways. Mine was fairly mild. It was probably a typical thing because I was a little guy. But that stayed with me. And historically, America has done some great things in its history. Probably the biggest one is, despite the last 8 years, give or take, immigrants still want to come here.
Right.
With all the violence, with all the anti-immigrant rhetoric, people from other countries who have really difficult lives, whether coming from Europe, coming from Africa, coming from Central and South America, coming from parts of Asia, despite being discriminated against once they're here, they still want to come here. So I don't want to lose that thread, because they're not idiots for wanting to come here.
Right.
Yeah, there's a reason that they want to come here, because it is possible to build a good life in this country, but it's not a perfect place, far from it. And that's the narratives that I'm talking about. The line in, one of the most in American literature, towards a more perfect union. The founders knew they had something that was workable, and they knew it was far from perfect. So they built in the ability to amend it. So that's true. And most of them were slave owners, and that's true too. And both of those need to be addressed and honored. And anybody who plays just one side of that is partial, and in my language, is contributing to the proliferation and perpetuation of the problem of America, the kind of bipolar personality that the country has, because we really are so polarized. So what questions does that answer raise for you?
I appreciate you asking the question. And that's the whole context of our show, being fully human. So I look at it as you writing it allows you to be fully human in your expression of understanding that, right? Yeah. And as you said before, I don't think a lot of people realize now. I mean, definitely a lot of maybe baby boomers or folks who are even older generation definitely know it, but maybe millennials, Generation X's, and a lot of folks, Generation Z, don't know it. That, a lot of immigrants that came from Europe were not really accepted in this country. Right? Yeah. Even like you talk about Italians, folks will know this, that the history of Bank of America was started by Italians from their own bank because they were denied the ability to bank at other banks. So they created the origin of the grew the Bank of America. They created their own bank, their own banking system. So I definitely understand it and resonate with that. My question for answering it. It was really more for the other folks to maybe listening and wondering that. Like, let's just get that question out of the way, because I know folks have that question, right? I got to know you a little bit more, so my question went so much for my own personal validation. But I just want to set the context of that question. Now, one other thing too I want to talk about was, I think that as we talk about these narratives within America's history, I like to say these false narratives, they get created as a result that, you know, the person who conquers wins, they can tell whatever story they want to tell, and there were applications of that. And as you were talking, I was also thinking about several books, again, by white gentlemen who were groundbreaking in their accuracy of history, such as Howard Zinn's the United States, which, you know, I think to me should be a book that's mandatory reading by everybody. And I believe that the book, from the premise and the thesis you're talking about, should fit in that category, because we got to have these discussions, to your point. And growth can only happen. You know, I was on LinkedIn the other day, and one of the folks I'm in this pod with, the question was, how do you feel about disagreements? You know, and my reply to that question was, I think disagreements are the first step to active communication. It means that we're going to be engaged. If I disagree with you, then more likely I'm going to be present and engaged in that conversation that we're having, right? And now I should be open. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to be open to learn anything. The next step for me is to learn something from that disagreement. And we may disagree on the fact of, I think some people will say, where do we stand on gun violence, you know, gun legislation? Now, I'm a proponent that believes that, you know, just from my experience in this country, I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with this, but, you know, I would believe that, you know, as long as police officers have guns, then the citizens should have guns, right? Gun control, definitely, I think we should have things in place such as, you know, age requirements. Young should be able to buy assault weapons under 21. I think that's definitely something that's more politicalized. And I mean, I think everybody can really agree. If you really think from a logical standpoint, that, you know, why would you need at 19 to go buy an assault rifle? What justification that we create a law that lets you do that, right? It's an inconvenience. It's like, if you can fight that law, well, I'm sure you can also argue that you should be able to drink prior to that, right? It should be an argument to justify, I should be able to drink. Why should I wait until I'm 21 to be able to drink? So I think disagreements are healthy when people are looking to learn from the conversation. And I think your book will definitely spark some folks who are going to double down their tries, right? And say, from my perspective, this was wrong, this, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying that folks wasn't wrong in doing what they did. I think what we can do is say, what can we learn from that now? Should be the question we build from. And I think your book incites those questions, at least from my perspective. It's how do we learn from that? Because again, I think one of the false narratives that we function in the society is that when we talk about black and white, or man and woman, everybody always groups everybody as though if you are black or you're white, or you're male or you're woman, male or female, that you are forced to think monolithic based off your gender, based off your race, and nothing else can be further from the truth. So, you know, like, all black people don't think one way, all white people don't think one way, or as you say, are folks now that within 1970s, when they start classifying where Europeans is, well, you've been pushed to the right race. You know, before, folks of the Jewish race wasn't considered white. They were discriminated against. They got pushed until, okay, now you're into the white race. You know, so we got to really get a look at that, and I say, truly say, and this is coming from the engineer in me, I'm a trained problem solver. Excuse me for this, man. I need to turn my alarm off. But as a trained problem solver, I'm always thinking, how do we solve the problem? Okay, in other words, I see the room is dark. Now, we can sit here all day and argue about, you know, whose fault is it? There's darkness. Whose And we can fight on that all day long.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we have to go ahead and figure out how to get this light on so that we actually can now function. And that's what I'm advocating. It's like, let's understand. So we need to understand the importance of history. Yes. But let's not live in the history to the point we can't move forward, because without truly progressive, honest, authentic communications designed not to necessarily solve it, but to just think differently. Let me learn something new that I didn't learn when I talked to an Irish gentleman, about your experience growing up here in this country and what you were taught to believe in your narratives from your society, your culture that taught you this. And same thing with a Jewish gentleman, the same thing that you say with an Irish gentleman. Then you take on a Black gentleman, a Native American gentleman. That's our females as well within that context. Let's really begin to sit down and say, what can we learn from each other's pain? And then what can we learn from each other's culture? And then how can we make that mean that we move better and going forward? I don't believe anybody on either side of the gun rights issue really wants more mass shootings. Right? I think if we can at least all agree there that whether you're against more gun legislation or you're for more gun legislation, no one wants another mass shooting incident, right? Where just innocent people get killed. So we can read at that fundamental level. Let's do that. The next step is to say, now how do we prevent that from happening, right? So that's where I'm really going with my thought process with the as it relates to race, as it relates to gender, as it relates to the Vietnam wars. How do we begin to really the war on terror, right? I think one other thing too before I turn it back over to you, it's easy for me to say this from a person who didn't write the book, but I kind of wish you threw one more war in there, and that was really the war on drugs, right? And because I think that's another false narrative that we've been fed in this country, and I think that war on drugs really decimated communities more so than anything else. And the late great George Carlton said that that's what American does, is that anything America wants to sit here and justify oppression, they put war on. Mm-hmm. War on drugs, things of that nature. But there's never a war on homelessness. Things where you obviously want to make an improvement. You don't use that language. There's no concerted effort. But you want to raise a lot of capital and get people's feelings and emotions stirred up, you put war on in front of, and we never win these wars. So. Yeah.
Well, I thank you for bringing up the drug piece too, because you're right. It's one of the things I mentioned in the book. It doesn't get its own chapter, but the one thing that I do point to there, and just speaks to the exact point you made, as when Richard Nixon was running for his second term, and this was Vietnam was going on, this was moving in towards 1972, and this is a quote. Not a quote. I'm going to remember vaguely what John Ehrlichman said in hindsight, that they had a problem with hippies protesting the war. Hippies. They had a problem with blacks in the inner cities, as they sort of as a problem. And what they did was intentionally tie in hallucinogens, LSD, and marijuana with hippies and the anti-war movement, and cocaine and heroin. I may have been both of those with inner city blacks, and they just put those two things out there. They did a really good job doing a bad thing, in order to get a naive, gullible American public to see the danger in the anti-war movement and the danger of African Americans in the inner city. And that was an intentional movement using drugs as a vehicle. So they had this war then on hallucinogens, a war on pot, a war on heroin, and basically used it to alienate unwanted by them segments of American culture. Make love not war, stone young white people, and then taking the inner city and painting blacks in the inner city as drug users. Period. It was an intentional thing. And the last piece of that I would say is the war on drugs in any serious way has never looked at. And this is something that you, Kent, and I spoke about 2 weeks ago, I think. There's a reason that addiction is a problem in this society. Because if this were a healthy society, if we took care of our children and our elderly, and I'm not going to qualify that by adding any ethnic or gender or racial qualifiers. If we took care of our children and our elderly, and there was equal education for everyone, equal health care for everyone, not just children, but for everyone. In a healthier culture, fewer people would choose to escape through addiction, because addiction is an escape from the present moment. This is too hard for me, and I need to do something not to be here. And you can use alcohol, you can use any kind of drug to do it. I mean, opioids are arguably our biggest one right now, and that was made possible because of greed.
Right.
Because the pharmaceutical industry, and specifically, I'll mention where I live now in Connecticut. The Sackler family in Purdue Pharma, who almost single-handedly, created that epidemic. So we need to heal our narratives so we can heal our cultures and make this a healthier place to live. So shooting up a school or a supermarket or overdosing on opioids or pointing fingers all the time are no longer attractive ways of being when we disagree with someone. And to your point, the disagreement is the beginning of a move towards healing, if I'm really willing to learn. If I'm just willing to point my finger because I know I'm right, then that's the problem we do have now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I was watching Bill Maher recently, his latest HBO show. He made this point to say how Hollywood is considered very liberal. And again, pro more gun legislation. They don't talk about their culpability with producing gun violence. He really broke down an eloquent argument, because he talks about how every movie we watch is about solving a problem with guns. There's a guy who's a great guy, but then some tragic incident happened to him. His dog dies, his wife gets killed, he gets robbed, and then he has to take vengeance. And he gets a gun to take vengeance. And he goes out and he decimates with vengeance. Right, listen, you watch it. We've watched it repeatedly happen over and over again. And so how can you not think that that's not going to have an impact on someone who's impressionable, who's a teen, and thinks that way? Well, that's how you really solve a problem. If I really want to solve a problem, if I'm experiencing bullying at school, to your point, where I'm ostracized, I'm victimized by folks because I'm different, well, the way to respond is to get a gun and just decimate folks, right? Yeah. Now, some folks will say you can't really draw a one-on-one correlation to that. But see, my question becomes, how many more mass shootings need to happen in schools before Hollywood says, maybe it might not be a direct correlation, but maybe we should not, for the summer, shoot any more action movies to see if it does have an impact. Can we, push the desire for greed and dollars aside? Or maybe the actors who come out and say that they're against gun violence, say, I'm not going to play any more roles like that for at least 2 years, just to change the culture for a moment and see if that has any impact. that's the kind of steps I'm looking for folks to take. To me, when you realize that something has gotten to the point where it's not even shocking anymore. Right. It's just a matter of when's the next one going to happen, yep. How many kids are going to die, and what schools are going to be. Right. That's really the only uncertainty we know it's going to happen again. We know it's going to happen repeatedly. It's like, at what point do we just get to the point where we're saying, let's just do something different to maybe prevent that from happening, right? And that means that my rights, because again, I'm a gun owner. I believe that, I feel, to be honest, that I live in a state in Maryland in which I think the laws are too restrictive. Because to be a criminal, if I want to go buy a gun illegally, I can go buy a gun literally in 3 minutes from my house and get it, and I'm done. Where if I want to buy a gun as a legal citizen, I got to go through a course. It takes 8 hours to complete. Then I got to wait 7 days to get my license and my ability to use it. Then I can only buy one gun every 30 days. And it's like, that to me is very restrictive. Where again, if I want to buy a legal gun, I can do it. I can buy as many as I want. So it's like you're punishing me as a regular citizen living in a city where it's nothing but gun violence, and I got to wait all this time frame, right? So that's my personal bias against it. But if it meant that less schools it would prevent more the likelihood of preventing mass shootings from happening, then I would say give me more regulation on that. If I have to wait 3 months to get a gun to reduce that likelihood, I'm all for that, right? So I'm that person that thinks that way. If it solves the problem or it reduces the likelihood, I will forego some of my rights. I don't have to sit there and fight for that right to the point where I'm willing to kill for it, or I'm willing to put people in office who I don't agree with any of the issue that they're running for, but they stand for that issue, and that's the reason I elect, right? I think to your point about polarization, that's what we got to get away from, and really get, as we talk about more fully, it's more humane to look at what can I give up or what can I sacrifice for the greater good.
Yeah, no, I love that analogy of first of all, owning that you're a gun owner and the restrictions in Maryland and how you feel they're too restrictive. But if in fact that's what it took to end or at least minimize these mass shootings, you'd be willing to go along with that, even though you feel that it's unfair. And one of the places that something I hadn't heard before, and it's going back, I don't know, 6 or 7 years now. So one of the students who was in a high school where I taught in Yonkers back in the 70s and 80s, became one of the parents at Sandy Hook. So his first grade son was killed in the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012. And I met with him in 2016 and had a conversation, which was, I love talking to people, and I've talked to people who have suffered greatly. And that was probably the place where I felt least adequate to say, what do you say to somebody whose child was killed, first grader was killed. But one of the things that Sandy Hook promised, that's the organization that I think 3 of the families founded, they've been educating people across the country now. They go into schools and, they work on, trying to get some legislation passed and all that. But they really went in and just began to educate people in schools, warning signs, different things that they learned through their own horrific experience. And the one thing, this is Mark Barton is his name. He's a public figure, so I'll say his name, that he said, and I had never heard this before, and it's probably because just my own ignorance, is probably what had been out there, but he uses automobile safety, car safety, as a historical analogy. If you look back to how people died in car crashes in the 50s and 60s into the 70s, and the kind of piecemeal but ongoing legislation, everything from seatbelts to airbags to construction of cars, to various things with speed limits, Gradually, in a bipartisan way, over several decades, car safety, and I don't know the percentage, but it increased in really big ways. So that's the approach that they're taking with regard to gun safety. In other words, they know they're not anti-Second Amendment people. They know that's saying take away all the guns. That's not their argument. But to take this integrated approach, okay, no, assault weapons is one thing, handgun is another thing, and begin to educate people from all these different perspectives, whatever the analogous pieces of legislation would be to seatbelts, airbags, speed limits, construction of the car, whatever that would mean in the gun industry. That's what they advocate for. But when we have, every most recent shooting, like the Texas in Uvalde, basically the state of Texas basically said it's a mental health issue, period. That's it's that polarized. Nothing about guns or access or anything like that. So that polarization again affects virtually every issue in the country. And that's the thing that needs to be healed, because it's not just one thing. As you said, if they took away guns from every legal gun owner, then only illegal gun owners would have guns, or mentally ill people would have guns, and that's who commits the mass shootings. And even that's a kind of a red herring, because the real problem in this country is the everyday shootings.
Right.
The mass shootings get the headlines, but we have 103 people a day, about 2/3 of which are suicides by gun violence. But 103 people every day die through gun violence. And those aren't healthy people. They're not. I mean, because healthy people don't do that. Now, the doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists will get into debates about, okay, what does healthy mean? And that's beyond this, my expertise. But I'm pretty sure that healthy people don't pick up a gun, or even, and plan to go someplace, as the guy up in Buffalo at the supermarket did. I mean, which was racially motivated. That's not a healthy individual, right, by any definition of health. And that's all of the things that we need to pay attention to. I'd be interested in knowing what his childhood was like, what his education was like, and what led him to think that was a good idea. And it's a really, multifaceted issue. And anybody who thinks this one band-aid is going to fix it, okay, all right, no more assault weapons, or armed teachers. If ever there was I think it's a really bad idea, since local police haven't been effective in intervening. So we're going to start giving people who just wanted to be educators, because they love kids and learning, arming them and thinking that's a good idea. I mean, that's, sorry for it.
Really, yeah, I'm sorry, I may cut you off.
No, that's fine.
But to me, the idea of arming teachers is clearly just a capitalistic solution to it. Like, we want to sell more guns, because teachers, anytime you're a teacher, obviously, and you know that if you're in a situation where you are dealing with people who 30 to 40 kids, different personalities, different energies at home, different crises at home, come to school, bring it to school, and now here you are as a person with a gun that can now respond if you having a bad day. Kids trigger you just because you've been learning how to shoot safely doesn't mean you've been able to mentally deal with that issue and block it out, right? I'm the son of a police officer. My father was a police officer. His twin brother was a police officer. I had two other uncles that were police officers. I grew up in a family of police officers when I was a kid. So I understand that side of the argument, where if you are patrolling a city that's violent, and you can get shot, and there's people literally dying every single day on those street corners, or getting robbed or victimized if you don't have a gun. Now you're a cop, and you have the right to, or not the right, but you have the ability to actually take someone's life. It brings a different perspective to things. You know, when you can't let that outside drama bring into your world, you can't let the fact that your bills are late, your wife is getting on your nerves, your kids are fun in school, your car got towed or wherever it is. Now you bring that kind of energy, and now you're a police officer. And the first time someone steps out of line, you have the ability to take their life because you've been triggered, right? So for me, it's like, if we're gonna have, I would say this about Maryland's gun education class. The 8-hour class was very informative. Now, you know, initially I didn't want to go because it was like 8 hours of my day to go sit in the class and drive where I had to go. But when I actually began to learn about different guns, different gun types, and how to use them and all those things, it was like, wow, I'm much more informed now. I saw value in it. I didn't see value in waiting 7 more days and all that, but the education class was definitely something that, you know, teaching you, make sure that you always hold the gun down, the barrel down, right? Those things are key and critical. I think if you're going to have a gun, you have to be educated. If you're going to be put in a position of a person that has the ability to take someone else's life, like a teacher or a police officer, there has to be some great education with that. And I think that that's where we also got to look at making sure we wean out the mental illness. I guarantee you that there's a lot of mentally stressed out PSTD teachers teaching kids anyway. And you don't give them guns just because you're saying that's going to make the school safer, which I don't believe it will.
No, I mean, to take a school, let's assume that generally speaking, schools don't have guns in them unless they have a school safety officer who's, you know, on the local police force. So the idea that depending on the size of the school, and I'm smiling as I say this, but it's not funny at all. So let's say the elementary school with 10 classrooms. So now we're bringing in, I'll assume the principal gets one too. So we're bringing 10, 11 guns into the school. If it's a big high school, maybe we're bringing 40 guns into the school, 50 guns into the school, because the teachers each have one now. And at some point, you know, that either are they going to, I don't know if they're going to be carrying them or if they're going to have them in a lockbox in, you know, in their classroom. But at some point, as happens with people who are careless at home with firearms, that gun stands a chance of being, you know, found and taken by somebody who shouldn't find and take it.
Right.
So I mean, you know, and plus teachers are leaving now just because of what happened with COVID. I mean, their lives have been so stressed. I don't know any teachers, and maybe one or two, that if they were required to have a gun in the classroom, I don't know any of them that would stay in the profession. You know, maybe one or two, and one in particular who's a great guy. He's a retired Marine, did 20 years in the Marines. Now he's got 17 years as a public school teacher, and he's great. You know, he's a guy you want your kids to have in a classroom. You know, he wouldn't have a big deal with it because he knows how to use a weapon. But the vast majority of teachers who weren't previously Marines, they would probably walk away from the profession if they had, you know, get trained to use a gun.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, and as we get ready to wrap up today's session, one of the things we like to do, and I think this has been a very thoughtful session, you know, a very good session in the context of topics we talked about. But we want to always end with an example of who you feel is someone who exhibits being fully human.
Yeah. See, I know that's coming. I didn't even think about it. So you go first now. So
I would go first. I would say that someone who I feel, and it could be somebody historic, someone current. I would say someone current, historic. It would be Nelson Mandela. I think that, to me, he showed the truest definition of forgiveness. To really mean what it really means to actually forgive someone. And to me, that is an example of someone, and I actually seek to be that fully human on my journey enough to be able to forgive at the level he does. And I'm not there yet. The way he was able to forgive his captors, his jailers, and then still work with them to build within his government is truly something I think is phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. So I'll go with this time around. I'll go with recently late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because she took, among many things she did, but she took very seriously the 14th Amendment, equal protection of laws, and she's known primarily as a very liberal jurist and Supreme Court justice who fought for equal rights for women. But early in her career, with her husband, who was also an attorney, she defended a man who was discriminated against. He was a caregiver for his dying mother, and because of the way the laws were written, in whatever the state was, I forget what state it was, he was discriminated against because he had never been married and because he was a man, and men didn't typically fall into the role of caregivers from a legal perspective. And so they won that case, and they got a settlement for this man. His last name was Moritz, Moritz. I forget all the details, that the courts weren't willing to give him because he was a man, and he would have gotten so automatically had he been a woman. So Bader Ginsburg was really clear that she wasn't just trying to get equal rights for women. She wanted the Constitution to apply equally to every human being. And so I aspire to that as well.
Well, Reggie, thank you for sharing that. And again, this has been a wonderful session with you. Again, this has been Fully Human Connections podcast. We do these every Wednesday at 10 a.m. And everyone who's listening to this, thank you for investing your time and energy. So, Reggie, thank you again for joining me today. And you have
You're welcome, and thanks. I always enjoy our conversations. Thank you, King.
Take care.
Bye-bye.